We are the Mission Possible Partnership, an alliance of climate leaders on the road to transforming 7 of the highest emitting industries towards net zero emission. Through radical collaboration with industry leaders, their customers, financial institutions, and governments, we are creating a flywheel, decarbonizing industries. By providing sector strategies and a compass and developing the tools to implement them, we're setting the milestones for the next decade and igniting climate action. Are you a climate leader? Together, let's unlock investment and make net zero industry and mobility pillars of the new global economy.
Steel sector emissions account for over 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's vitally important that the steel sector works towards a much more responsible and sustainable way of producing steel over the next few years. SteelZero is a really exciting new initiative that is being run by the Climate Group and Responsible Steel, all geared around a steel industry that is working to be net zero by 2050.
As one of the 5 largest renewable energy companies in the world, procuring a lot of steel every year, if we want to reach net zero in our supply chain in 20 years from now, there needs to be a commercially viable steel production which is carbon neutral. It will require major innovation. It's a challenge we need to solve as a global community and as a global industry. That's why it's very beneficial for us to be part of SteelZero, because this is obviously not something we can do alone.
Our mission at the Climate Group is to drive climate action fast. It is inevitable that the steel sector is going to have to adapt. Organizations that act now and plan for net zero steel will be better positioned in the future.
We've been working so far with many companies and organisations in the construction sector, in the automotive sector and in the renewable energy sector. These companies that are joining SteelZero will be part of a global movement that is taking and showing a very strong demand signal back to steel makers and producers in the move towards producing responsible zero carbon steel.
Every transformational change starts with a trigger point. It's that point when a brilliant idea spreads like wildflowers and changes the way we live. If humanity ever needed such a trigger point, it's now. The engine driving our modern way of life is also choking our planet, and it's not slowing down. The world is expected to build the equivalent of another New York City every month for the next 40 years. Emitting dangerous levels of climate-warming gases. But what if the products used, such as steel and concrete, to build our future homes, roads, bridges, hospitals and schools were low carbon? Industry has proven technology to make this a reality. And at the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, we want to help this technology to grow and spread, ultimately turning the tide. We are a large and diverse coalition of governments and private sector organizations working to decarbonize heavy industry. Starting with steel, cement and concrete, we envisage a thriving global market for low-carbon industrial products. Together, we are developing global standards, supply chain reporting systems to track carbon, and green public procurement policies. Already our government partners, who are among the largest buyers of public construction materials, are making pledges to purchase low-carbon steel and concrete, triggering transformational change and ultimately turning the tide. You can be a part of this coalition and help fast-track a greener future. Find out more today.
Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Liu. I'm a fellow at the World Economic Forum and a principal at the Boston Consulting Group, Copenhagen. Very pleased to be here today at the Cities, Regions and Built Environment Day at COP26. Thank you for joining us both online physically and physically here at the UK Pavilion. We are here to discuss construction decarbonisation, a topic that is key when we think about decarbonising the built environment. The construction sector is responsible for around 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, where cement, concrete, and steel are some of the key building materials. Our objective with our time here today is to share about some of the actions that the public sector and private sector leaders are already taking, and have a discussion about whether this is enough to decarbonize construction. Before introducing our panel, I would first like to welcome Lord Callanan, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, for his welcome message.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pamela, and welcome everybody to the Kickstarting Construction Decarbonisation event. And decarbonising the construction sector will play a critical role in helping us to reach net zero. Buildings and construction as a whole, as we all know, represent nearly 40% of global emissions, with materials such as cement and steel making up an increasingly growing share. To decarbonise the sector, to create new demand for low-carbon materials, which will ensure the decarbonisation of processes along the supply chain. I'm sure you are all looking forward today to hearing some of the leading initiatives and companies who are working to deliver a decarbonised built environment, many of whom the UK government is working closely with to help us to achieve our climate goals. First, I want to set out how the UK, as the COP26 presidency, is working to motivate countries and companies committed to the purchase of low-carbon materials to help make the transition faster, to make it easier, and to make it cheaper for everyone. Earlier this year, the UK, along with India, launched the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative. This will align government's actions to create markets for low-carbon industrial products via work on data, on standards, and on procurement. Now, with support from Germany, from Canada, and from the UAE, this initiative represents around 15% of global GDP, and we expect new country partners to join with us next year. Under the initiative, we're now launching 3 new working groups to enable rapid decarbonisation of the construction industry, providing tools and harmonised calculations for carbon data collection, for product standards, and for procurement guidelines. Several members of this initiative, including the UK, have committed 2 days ago to disclosing embodied carbon data in all major construction projects by 2025. We've also pledged for public construction to be net zero by 2050, and we'll work towards an interim carbon reduction target to be announced at the 13th Clean Energy Ministerial next year. This is a major step to providing the data that we need to better understand the construction industry's emissions and to put us all in better stead to reduce them. But it's clear, of course, that national governments cannot do this on our own. I'm encouraged by some of the excellent steps being taken by cities, by states, and the private sector to help us to create early markets for green materials. This includes the Clean Construction Forum under C40, which works with cities to send a clear signal to steel and cement producers that municipal governments want to use clean materials in the future. We're also seeing some encouraging signs from state governors, such as the collection of leaders in the US under the Pacific Coast Collaborative launched earlier. Taken together, these commitments from US states are equivalent to the 5th largest economy, all now supporting buy clean standards. In the private sector, we've been working closely with the Climate Group under their SteelZero and ConcreteZero initiatives, which feature a number of leading UK companies such as BHC and the Bourne Group. These initiatives are pivoting global markets and policies towards responsible production and sourcing of steel and concrete. I'm also pleased to welcome the launch of the First Movers Coalition, which was announced last week with the support of the US and the World Economic Forum. This vital initiative will help accelerate the deployment of breakthrough industry technologies, and the UK is extremely proud to support it. Through all of these various initiatives, spanning regions, spanning nations, both the public and the private sector, developed and developing countries together, I believe that we can affect the mass market change that we all want and need to see. So I look forward to working with all of you in the future to make the future of construction brighter and greener. Thank you very much indeed, Pamela.
Thank you, Lord Callanan. Collaboration between the public-private sectors are indeed key, and it's my pleasure to welcome our panel today, where we have representatives from both public and private sector. Starting first on my right, we have Stephen Sikaris, Managing Director of the Directorate of Energy and Environment in the United Nations Industrial Decarbonization Organization. To his right, we have Magali Anderson, Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Holcim. To her right, we have Tor Burrows, Executive Director of Sustainability and Innovation for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland. To her right, we have Steve Adler, Mayor of Austin, Texas. And last but not least, we have James Drinkwater, Head of the Built Environment Program at Louds Foundation. Thank you for joining us. To kick us off, Stephen, so the United Nations Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative is the coordinator of the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative that Lord Callanan mentioned earlier. Could you tell us more about this initiative and the pledge that was announced on Tuesday this week?
Thank you very much. I will do my very best, although the previous speaker has already alluded to a lot of the overarching issues, but still, I think there's a lot of details to be filled in. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased today to join you, all of you, on the 26th meeting of the COP here, a COP which is showing an unprecedented momentum for the industrial decarbonization, thanks to the effort of many partners gathered also here in this very room. The demand for materials produced by heavy industries is growing as our societies develop and grow, no matter where they are on this planet. And actually, for the construction sector that we are dealing with today and talking about today, the growth in developing countries is tremendously higher aggregated than the growth that we are seeing in industrialized countries, which is why global efforts on this matter so much to all of us. Scientists, as said, estimate that the world will build the equivalent of a New York City every month for the next 40 years, and actually construction materials is the only resource which will increase per capita globally substantially in the next 40 years by around 60%, if I have the numbers right, while everything else will actually be steady or decline calculated on a per capita basis. So construction is one of our main challenges. In any case, in addition, it is of course connected to industrial sectors which are having severe problems to reduce their carbon imprint, which is why we are here today. So how do we align this growth that we are expecting with the demands on climate change, and how do we actually turn the tide in allowing affordable housing across the world, and at the same time allowing growth of our economies, and at the same time achieving our climate targets? This is why we try to move forward on the matter of decarbonization, and the challenge is that the high cost required for the implementation of the technologies, the absence of standardized methodology for accounting of embodied carbon in any product or pre-product, and the lack of a harmonized and simple standard accepted across the industry and adopted by governments are things which are holding back the transition that we are so urgently hoping for. So, to ensure that these sectors are on track towards the 2030 and 2050 sustainable development, we need coordinated efforts at a global level. It is really important to get all, or at least many players, into our train moving forward. It is to spur the demand for green steel and green cement, and to incentivize, of course, clean energy innovation and adoption in those specific sectors. So, in order to get there, governments must leverage the efforts of the private sector to decarbonize these industries and must give the industry signal to undertake significant investments in clean energy and innovation, and that has to be done starting today, or rather increasing today. In this context, I'm pleased to come back to the pledge announced 2 days ago, namely to work towards disclosure of embodied carbon on public projects by 2025. So in 3 years from now, not a very long time, align public procurement policies with the net zero goals by 2050, and work together towards announcing a target, as said, by next year, the next 13th meeting of the Clean Energy Ministerial, for green public procurement. Now, the devil is in the details, as they say, and this is actually where we are coming in. It is to be undertaken under the umbrella of the Clean Energy Ministerial through the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative, IDDI, and in close cooperation with the governments of the UK, of course, Canada, Germany, and India. So the pledges give the political signal and security that companies are seeking to invest in capital-intensive projects to decarbonize their industries, but there's still a need to promote an intergovernmental and industry dialogue to resolve a lot of the critical barriers for a thriving market on low-carbon construction material. IDDI will therefore work on driving a thriving market for this material, steel, cement, and concrete in particular, by tackling 3 key bottlenecks: standards, disclosure frameworks for carbon, and green public procurement. Consequently, we will have the 3 working groups which are meant to deliver transparent and simple framework for reporting, a harmonized and widely recognized standard for products, defining what in essence is green steel and what is green cement, and guidelines and best practices for green public procurement, which can actually follow on the first 2. The working groups will bring together representatives from industry, government, academia, civil society to agree on these topics. Won't be easy. We will be announcing the process for joining the working groups shortly after this COP and convening them in the beginning of the coming year. I would like to invite governments and industries to actively join these working groups. We are facilitating. You will have to do a lot of the lifting to help resolve barriers that are always coming across as critical, to help drive stepped actions in all of those sectors. And of course, I would like, again, as said before, to invite governments to start with their action today and join the pledge, helping us to establish a thriving market for these products. Back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's encouraging to see governments already making the first step forward in announcing such pledges, requiring disclosure of carbon and a net zero 2050 target, and aiming to have another announcement on the 2030 target by next year. Magali, Holcim is the world's largest cement and building material supplier. How do you view such pledges, and do you think they are aligned with your climate strategies?
So what I heard so far is music to my ears, because we are ready. We are ready as a company, we are ready as a sector, and we want to go that way. So Holcim, I could talk about the fact that we made our pledge last year with our 2030 target validated by SBTi, but also 10 days ago it was announced by SBTi we were one of the 7 companies who goes the full pathway all the way to zero validated as per the net standard. So we are very proud of that, but what I really want to talk about today is green product, because that's what it's all about. And today our green products, so I always hear that debate, should we put them on the market? Is there demand, not demand? And I think there's a moment we need to stop that chicken and egg story. So that's why we decided more than a year ago to launch our global green concrete. And it's quite amazing. In a year, we have got it now in 24 markets. It's about, to be called green concrete, it has to have minimum 30% less CO2 than the market equivalent, and all the way to 70% or even 100. It's been, for example, in India, 6 months after the introduction, it's representing 6% of the sales. So there is a demand. Is it enough? Absolutely not. You heard the challenges before. We need to go way further than that, and this is where legislation and the push for green product that you have been talking about is so important. So we are ready. Now, the coalition, and I would like to highlight 2 actions here that are important. The first one is the First Mover Coalition, which was announced by State Secretary John Kerry at the beginning of the COP, and we are part of it. And for us, it's very interesting because we are looking at both us as a supplier of green solutions, and I do say solution, not just material, because we have to look at how we put green product on the market, but also how we use this product better, how we build better, how we use, for example, 3D building where we can do the same object with much less cement or much less concrete. But also we look at it from our own supply chain. To give an example, Holcim, we have about 2 billion kilometers done every year to transport our product across the world. And having a pledge on the transportation from the First Mover Coalition, it's something we want to do, but we also need the transportation sector to move with us because it's not going to be able to do. And the second initiative I will talk about is about the Mission Possible partnership with the Concrete Action for Climate, which obviously looks at us. There was an announcement today, which is very interesting, and we are very happy to be part of it because this is going with the GCCA announcement that was made about 2 weeks ago. So we announced at GCCA, GCCA is a Global Cement and Concrete Association, which regroup 80% of the cement volume made in the world outside China. And we have been doing a work, we announced a year ago our net zero concrete, but what we announced 2 weeks ago was even better, was the actual roadmap. And it was a work done over 18 months, multi-holders. I had the honor to co-chair it, but what's amazing was a collective action here. All the CEOs agreeing, all of them agreeing that we should all move as a sector to net zero. So you can expect that these green products, you are going to see them, they are going to invade the market. That's what we intend to do. We need an invasion of green product. And we are ready, we have them. We just need now the triggers from the legislation and from the government. And that's why I think the MPP pledge of today is so important. I actually have there in the note if you want me to give them, or I don't know if I have time. I do have time. So sorry, I prefer to write it down because I think it's too important than to rely on my memory. So making net zero concrete manufacturing investable. I think at the end of the day, we are all businesses. If I always say sustainability has to be sustainable, and to be sustainable, it has to be a win-win. If not, there is a moment where we turn into being charity organization, and unfortunately, we can't sustain that for a long time. Creating market demand for carbon neutral construction and decarbonized value chain, and providing infrastructure for circular and net zero manufacturing. So I think it's a great pledge, and if that goes through, we, the sector, and us, Holcim in particular, will be absolutely ecstatic.
Thank you, Magali. Good to hear that you have announced net zero concrete and solutions, and you have actually a roadmap together. Next, we have Thor from Grosvenor. Grosvenor is a well-known sustainability leader in the commercial developer space. Have you taken similar actions on creating green demand signals in your business? And would you welcome such green products, for example, from Holcim, if they're available?
Great. Thank you, Pamela. Can you all hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So just very briefly, Grosvenor are a 340-year-old family-owned property company. We're predominantly based in London, but also in some other regional cities as well, such as Liverpool, Manchester, and Birmingham. We very much invest and develop for the long term, and we've got 4 ambitious green goals, one of which is to be net zero carbon as a business by 2030. So that's across all 3 scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3, and 97% of our footprint is in scope 3, so it's 97% of our emissions are indirect. So that's a challenge in itself. So as part of our net zero carbon commitment by 2030, we will cut our emissions in half at least, so a 52% reduction across all our scopes, and that's in line with climate science, so in line with keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So we've been cutting our operational emissions for a while, but also our embodied carbon as well. So embodied carbon makes up about 12% of our footprint. And that's actually, in a business as usual approach, that actually goes up to about 23% because of our targets. That reduces down to 12. So we have set very clear objectives for our development business to reduce the embodied carbon. So we've committed to be net zero carbon developments for our operational emissions as well as our embodied carbon as well. So the materials that we use in our developments are really significant. And today I'm just going to touch on steel. So Grosvenor are founding members of SteelZero, which was set up by the Climate Group, as Pamela mentioned. And SteelZero is a global initiative to really bring together the leading organisations to help speed up the net zero transition in the steel industry. As part of joining SteelZero, we publicly committed to procure, specify or stock 100% net zero steel by 2050, and then the interim target is 50% by 2030. And I suppose as a developer and property owner, the reason we did this is we want to be part of the change. You know, we really want to work with our supply chain. We want to understand some of the challenges with these low carbon construction materials. We want to innovate with our supply chain and radically collaborate from the clients all the way down to the manufacturers. And ultimately, as a client, we want to feel confident that the embodied carbon targets that we put in all our tender processes can be delivered upon. So I just wanted to finish by bringing this to life with a case study. So South Molton Triangle is a case study in London, in the West End. It's a 150,000 square foot office building with associated retail and leisure. It's just, for those that know it, just back from Oxford Street near Bond Street Tube Station. And for this new community in the West End, it comprises 2 steel frame buildings with about 3,000 tonnes of steel, so very significant. And the site is, like a lot of London sites, very constrained by heritage, and we've got a lot of listed facades. So at the moment, the sort of business as usual, we're having to use sort of bespoke fabricated steel, which clearly is very carbon hungry. But using the SteelZero principles and due to our embodied carbon targets that we've embedded in all of our development processes, we're working with our structural engineers and the steel fabricators and producers. And as we go into REBA stage 3, so we go into the detailed design, we're really looking at how we can tweak the design in order to reduce the embodied carbon, so engaging with our supply chain at this early stage. And the conclusion, the sort of early conclusion we're coming to is that if we tweak the design and tweak some of the sections by millimetres at a time, we can use rolled sections rather than fabricated steel, which is 5 times lower embodied carbon. And it also has significant sort of cost and program benefits as well. So it doesn't sound that radical, but I suppose my message here is engaging in your supply chain early and ensuring that you haven't finished the detailed design before you understand what materials you're going to use can have a really significant impact and reduce the embodied carbon of our developments. So proactive engagement is critical, and I suppose my call really is that all clients, developers, public and private sector can give a really strong market demand for low carbon buildings, because that inevitably will have the ripple effect throughout the industry. It will drive momentum, it will drive innovation, it'll increase supply and reduce costs, and ultimately give us low embodied carbon buildings, which frankly the climate emergency demands.
Thank you, Tor. Austin, as a member of C40 cities, whose mission is to halve emissions within the next decade, what do you see are the roles of cities in decarbonizing construction?
I think the role of the cities is to help create the demand so that the technologies can be developed and so that the market is present. It's to create the expectation through the policies. But I think it's a joint process too, because it's a chicken and the egg argument. In order to be able to create the demand, you have to be able to provide the system. It's great to hear of the advances in steel and the advances in concrete. That doesn't give you a score for a building yet. It gives you a score for a component of a building. It's going to be harder to be able to build around components as opposed to products. But I am encouraged that the aspirational, the mostly aspirational language on this subject is beginning to turn from something that is less measurable and more objective. Austin, Texas is the 11th largest city in the United States. It's the fastest growing large metropolitan area in the country and has been for each of the last 10 years. Despite that geometric growth, our carbon footprint has been going down over that last 10 years every year. It's a city of early adopters. It's an innovative, cool city. Magical, but then I'm mayor, so I'm a little biased. But I can remember the conversations very similar to this that were occurring 20, 25 years ago with respect to the technologies for sustainable energy, because wind power costs too much and solar power costs too much. And while we were being told it could be delivered, we were also being told that there wasn't a market to pay for the product at the price that the product would, that the service would cost. Austin was one of the cities that invested early in sustainable energy, making power more expensive in our city for people that were getting power. But we recognized if we weren't doing that, we weren't doing our part, then we wouldn't drive the technological advancements and the scale necessary to bring the cost down. As it turns out now, whenever we make an investment in sustainable energy, we actually average down the cost to our customers of our power system. But it also meant that we had to be very careful over the course of that period of time to be able to do that in a way that was equitable to the community. Because despite the best wishes that increased or a premium cost associated with an ecologically sustainable product is not an equal burden to everybody that is being asked to partake. So you have to set up a system, which then becomes, to the answer to your question in a long roundabout way, it's the obligation, I think, of the government and cities to make sure that this progress is being done in a way that is equitable. Because if it's not, then this kind of advancement that brings about a great relief and great action with respect to climate change mitigation will burden the people that are also most hurt by inability to act. Our climate plan that we originally developed in Austin just was redone, as cities across the world are being asked to do. Our 2050 goals got turned into 2040 goals. We worked backwards to figure out what it was that we needed to be able to achieve in order to be able to meet those goals. We changed our 2030 goals, we changed our 5-year goals and our 3-year goals in order to be able to continue to meet the things that we needed to do. We've moved forward on energy generation issues, on transportation issues, but I think it's a telling story because in the middle of the pandemic, facing transportation, which was our next big area, our community went to the polls, middle of the pandemic, and voted to increase their city property taxes by 20% in order to be able to give us a mass transit system that was necessary for us to provide both equity in our city and climate change, meet our climate change responsibilities. I think the same thing will happen in building. I think the market will be there as soon as we can actually explain to someone that the house that they're buying or whether the construction that's going on has a significant impact. We're not quite there yet because you can't go to the hardware store and pick up something and look at the end to see on the code how much carbon is embodied in that product. And we have to get to that place, which means it has to be standardized. There has to be cooperation within the industry to a level that doesn't exist today in order to be able to reach that standardization, which is going to be necessary to be able to drive the demand and help us when we're writing the code that requires and creates the demand that you need in order to be able to invest in the technology. So we are all joined at the hip in this effort.
Thank you, Steve. It sounds like we have the bookends of this problem figured out. We know that we want green construction projects. We have suppliers ready to do that. We know at the end game, we think that there will be a place for a green construction market where people will understand that it's decarbonized, it's equitable, and it's good for the environment. It sounds like what we haven't figured out is how to get from here to there. There are some steps in between that's being mentioned, that's being alluded to, which I would like to explore later. But before that, last but not least, we have James. We have heard a bit about concrete. We have heard from Tor a little bit about steel in the built environment. James, you recently launched the Built by Nature initiative, where you talk about timber and other bio-based products. Could you tell us more about this initiative?
Sure, with pleasure. So, first of all, it's fantastic to hear and be kind of hearing this collaboration sparked, because, you know, the cities we're dreaming of in the future will be a hybrid of different solutions. We need everything at the table. We need, you know, cross-industry collaboration, private and public sector, which is fantastic. And the Loudest Foundation, as a private philanthropy, is trying to enable these demand drivers, working with big industry players on the developer side, institutional investors, cities and others, to actually create this demand for low-carbon solutions from all of our colleagues here. But we've also been very inspired by some recent climate research, particularly coming out of the Potsdam Climate Institute, John Schnellenhuber and colleagues, looking at actually how we can join our forests and our built environment, particularly through mass timber. And actually more broadly, bio-based materials, low-carbon bio-based materials, we feel can play a bigger role in our built environment than they do today. They've not gone through this same kind of revolution until quite recently, so we have stuck in our minds that you know, timber is an older building material, but actually there's a huge potential for mass timber. So in launching Built by Nature, we've built a network of partners, of industry front runners on the demand side, and a fund that is there to actually fund those very granular solutions, as you said, that journey of the how do you start to scale up the use of these materials and scale that up in the right way. Because this isn't just about, again, the embodied carbon impact. When you're looking at this forest to buildings journey, it's about, are you actually enabling forests through proper sourcing to actually enhance their carbon sequestration capacity? We have to remove a hell of a lot of this stuff from the atmosphere. Are you actually storing that carbon safely in buildings for generations by creating long life assets, using this in circular ways? So we're looking at that North Star, and Built by Nature has started to set up these national networks, again, of these demand-side actors, insurers, institutional investors, developers, cities and others, alongside partners like the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, Climate Kick and others, who've started to do these deep demonstrations. It's funding some of the research and innovation needed into some of these perception and performance issues like fire safety. We're funding UCL, experts there, along with leading timber architects, War Thistleton, to actually look at how these buildings can meet all code compliance and actually start to safely scale. And we're starting to move from those demonstration projects, again, that show what's possible in terms of multi-story mass timber buildings, particularly in the residential sector, and taking that to city scale with cities like my hometown of Amsterdam. These days, you can tell I'm probably not from there, but Amsterdam has actually said, well, we want to actually do 20% of our new housing in timber and bio-based materials, and how. And you need these demand-side actors, you need these material innovators at the table. And this accelerator fund that's there to help fund that innovation, those specific solutions, getting the carbon, the technical, the economic performance of these assets right, is there to create really that pathway. But again, the future's hybrid, so we're very explicitly funding hybrid solutions with our colleagues, because timber simply can't do everything. I think we need all of these solutions really to be at the table together. And importantly, I think in our policy, we need to look at what are the right structures that do create this competition between materials for the best solutions, right? Because we've all got solutions to offer. And so again, that work on procurement with cities and others will be part of this. But I would say, I mean, I think, again, a critical part of what we're looking to do as we tackle the very, you know, the real how in scaling beyond demo projects to really doing stuff at the city scale with the Amsterdams and others, critical part of that is having the right carbon frameworks to get this right. Again, that look across that sequester, store, substitute effect. That's absolutely critical. So that's one of the things we'll be really working on to create that North Star for the proper use of bio-based materials as they scale.
Thank you, James. We're looking forward to that North Star. Moving forward, so I think we've now established, we've talked about chicken and egg. It sounds like we have the chicken and egg, right? So it doesn't matter which one comes first. We have the demand side already, we have the suppliers already. I would like to explore what is actually then stopping us from already doing this tomorrow or doing this in 5 years. What are the key things and the key topics you think we need to tackle in the near term? What are the challenges that's blocking us now that we need to unlock for us to actually have a net zero built environment? Stephen, please.
Thank you very much. The critical thing is, of course, we want to have a market. And of course, there are many solutions. There are the solutions to decarbonize the industry. There are the solutions to use alternative building materials, which I highly appreciate. And of course, also, as you said, actually, to reduce the use of building materials for the same purpose. All fine, but how do you get there? The market building element, in particular when we talk about public procurement, is really that clear, that governments come to setting clear targets, what they want to achieve. Just saying we want to have more green public procurement does not actually do it. The governments need to establish the targets in relation to what they have promised to achieve overall in terms of climate change objectives and mitigation objectives, and in relation to what is actually realistic that the industry can deliver. Because, I mean, let's face it, 2030 is around the corner. It's 8 years from now. If you start investing in heavy industrial infrastructure to build greener cement and greener steel, then this takes time, and the industry needs to have the basis for planning. So a clear interim target for green public procurement for 2030 is the first one. The second one is where the target would lie. And from our perspective, as far as we can see, 30 to 50% of the related public procurement would actually have to go to green building materials. That is a huge amount, 30 to 50%, to be delivered again in a period of 8 years. But from the climate change side, in order to deliver on the promises and on the pledges, we have to be in this magnitude. Thirdly, industry will have to reflect whether this can actually be delivered. There's no point having unrealistic pledges. And this dialogue has to happen rapidly. And this is actually why we are sitting here today and talk on this topic. Back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. So for you, it is about targets and making that very visible, making that very clear to the industry so that they have enough time horizon to plan for it.
And measurable, of course.
Yes,
visible
definitely.
And measurable by definition then.
Then next to Magali, so would such targets actually be helpful for you? And if yes, great. And if not, what else would you need, do you think, for you to really act on and make investment plans for?
Now, definitely they would be very useful. And to bounce back first on what you just said, we are not waiting. You know, it's not like we don't know what to do. The overall industry of cement has reduced their CO2 footprint per ton of cement by about 20% since 1990, earth holding by 28%. So we actually know we have traditional levers that we can use today. So it's not like if we don't have the target today, we can't start. I would say for me, the biggest thing is transparency. You talk about measure, I would go further. And that's when we start talking about life cycle assessment. So if you look at the built environment, a lot of CO2 comes from the embodied carbon, the famous carbon of the construction. More of it comes from the usage. And this is where the transparency on the total life cycle assessment, and we call it in sustainability jargon, is called EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, which looks at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 of the product over the full life cycle all the way to the end of life, would be very interesting. And then we would have what you were saying, going to a shop and seeing how much CO2, and that you would get it. Actually, in North America, it's relatively common. Some cities have already made it compulsory on their procurement process. Unfortunately, not that common in other places, because and of course I'm a concrete lover, I wouldn't be here if I was not. And why is concrete so sustainable? It's not just because we know how to make it low carbon. It's not just because with its thermal inertia in terms of heating and so on, it allows much less usage of energy for the building. But it's also because even though we want to expand the life of the buildings as much as possible, because at the end of the day, the best carbon is the one you don't need to use. So when you can expand the life, it's better. At the end of the life, we can take the demolition waste and put it back straight in the cement. We can use it as well as basement, as we are using most of it. But today we have a cement in Switzerland called SteelZero, where we use the rubble straight back in. Now, we only have it in Switzerland, and not because our headquarters is in Switzerland, because Switzerland is the only country in the world that allows it. Not because it's as you can imagine, if Switzerland allows it, that means in terms of strengths and everything, it has passed all the tests. But it's a question of evolution of the norms. And we're talking about having it allowed in Europe by end of 2022, early 2023. And I think today, and as you know, I'm in charge of both innovation and sustainability. One of the hurdle we need norms. Norms are extremely important, but innovation is going very fast, and we need the norms to evolve at the speed of innovation. And that is another thing that would clearly allows us to be much faster in producing those green products.
Thank you, Magali. So it is about ensuring that we have transparency of what we mean by embodied carbon. We have common standards. We have a common way to ensure that we apply them the right way and they were aligned. And there's something around ensuring that regulations almost keep up with innovation and what's actually available and possible in the built environment. Going on to Tor then, so you've already mentioned a great case example where you've already engaged the value chain, you've already looked into low carbon materials. Have you also started to see some challenges that are a little bit perhaps structural, systemic, that you hope would want to address also in the next decade?
Thank you very much. So I think fundamentally the way we have constructed buildings has stayed the same for a long time. So I think this is all about flipping the process on its head, taking a retrofit first approach and really thinking about what materials we have and what materials we use as early as possible in the design process. I think that's absolutely critical to reduce the embodied carbon of our developments as a priority. Our lowest embodied carbon development, a development that we're building at the moment called Holbein Gardens, the reason why that's our lowest embodied carbon development by a significant way is because we had our embodied carbon targets, but also because we're reusing a lot of materials that are already on site from the current site, but also from our other development projects as well. So it makes a really big difference. I think, whether it's steel, concrete, other low-carbon materials like CLT, there are challenges with them, whether that's policy and regulation, costs, and supply. But ultimately, I think if we can get this really clear demand and clear public and private sector procurement, then we will have this ripple effect that I spoke about that goes throughout the industry. We'll get more R&D into the products, we'll increase our supply, we'll get more innovation, and ultimately reduce the cost of them as well. But I do think it's worth saying that I agree that this whole live carbon approach is absolutely critical, and that's something that wasn't talked about a couple of years ago. So it's positive that we are talking about this now. We just need to go quicker and go further.
Thank you, Tor. Back to Austin, Steve. Are these challenges something that you recognize when we talk about targets, making things transparent, doing a whole life cycle assessment? And a follow-up question, so you've also talked about making the system equitable. Maybe also explaining a little bit more what you mean here. Equitable with who, for whom?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, just by way of just setting out, when we back up what we need to be able to achieve from a regulatory standard level, we have two building-related goals with the measurements in the plan that we have. By 2030, we want to achieve net zero carbon for all new buildings and reduce emissions by 25% for existing buildings. And our focus in our city beyond that is reducing natural gas-related emissions by 30%. Another goal that we have that relates to this is by 2030, we're trying to reduce the embodied carbon footprint of building materials used in construction by 40% against a 2020 baseline, which is about 500 kilogram per 100 square feet, per square foot, and about 100 pounds of carbon per square foot. So those are the goals that we would like to be able to achieve. When we talk about equity, I think you're talking about who it is that bears the burden of that shift. I mean, many times the new technologies cost money. Building supplies cost more, at least until the technology and the scale drives the ability to have prices down. So how do you move into that area where, when you're trying really desperately to build cheaper and cheaper housing, more and more affordable housing in cities like Austin, but virtually every city, there's not enough housing. There are too many people that are coming. It's driving up price. It's leading to dislocation issues and equity issues. The plan that we just did that I talked about, the Project Connect, which was the $7 billion transportation construction program, has a $300 million line item as part of the construction of that project that's to be spent on nothing but affordable housing strategies and dislocation strategies. So I think that you need to make sure that the education with respect to what it means, energy efficiency, how that impacts bills, that what people pay for utility costs, is something that's understood by communities that are oftentimes hardest to be able to get those messages, but then also to make the choices real and meaningful. How do you provide these technologies, these products to an entire community where everybody has an equitable access, which sometimes means going beyond equal access to those same kinds of things? Because again, I think that while we do this, while we do the climate mitigation, while we're taking care of the environment, we have to do it in a way that also takes care of the people.
Thank you, Steve. Going on to James, are some of these challenges that have been discussed, are these things that you also recognize? And do you think if we move towards life cycle assessment, having transparent targets and standards, would it also help with the built by nature, looking into tinder materials and products?
I mean, I think, we love built by nature, but it's about the whole sector, and as Laudes Foundation, that full decarbonisation journey, all of us going on it is critical. And to speak less about the challenges, frankly, than the solutions, I love what other speakers have said. We know it. And the IKEA Foundation and Laudes Foundation have just supported 10 national roadmaps, fully decarbonising the sector. It addresses whole life carbon, embodied carbon. We know the steps we need to take as industry. We know the infrastructure that we need, the kind of how we gather data and so on. Ultimately, national legislatures will have to regulate whole life and embodied carbon. That's key, actually, to really creating that clear demand signal. And there's some of the challenges around data and transparency. Some countries have done this exercise, your Denmarks, your Finlands. They've actually gone out, prepared those LCA studies, got a sense of where are we now, where do we need to go to. And I would say that the longer we put off that exercise, and we've said to governments, in the Europe region where we operate, we're happy to create a drawdown facility to bring academics, the best of industry around the table to create that data clarity. Where are we today? Where do we need to go to be Paris aligned? And let's set legislative targets as soon as possible so we innovate to meet them. The longer we put that off, really we're kind of, shrinking our carbon budget and every project we put forth in the world from that point. So again, these 10 national roadmaps, they set out at a very granular level, what can industry do now to create the critical mass of movement that will empower legislators, our friends in cities. You have such a critical role. They are taking a leadership position on this and setting that policy at the city level. That critical mass needs to come across the cities and industry, but eventually those targets need to be set. Otherwise, we run out of time. We're blowing our carbon budget.
Thank you, James. And maybe to round off with the last round of questions, and I think I would open it to the panel who would like to first jump in. I would like to look ahead. So we've talked about 2050, 2030. It sounds like we have a roadmap. The plan is clear. What would you like to see in the next 1 or 2 years? We need to also then start working backwards. We talk about 2030 a lot. What needs to happen in the next 1 to 5 years? If there is one thing that you wish for your own sector, from where you're coming from the public sector, from the private companies, well, what is that one thing that you think would really help you to accelerate this path and make it a reality? I'm judging on the most eager faces, and I would say Magali.
No, I think we kind of said it already, don't we? We talked about having a green procurement part of everybody's roadmap. When I mentioned environmental product declaration earlier, transparency, they exist today. There are cities today who are using them permanently. So I think really we are not waiting for anything magic. What the systems, the mechanism already exists. We just need them to be deployed in all the cities so we can support the cities to become net zero. We can support. I just wanted to mention something because I talked briefly about 3D printing. We can do incredible things nowadays with 3D printing. We do affordable houses. We do schools in Malawi nowadays. We can print a school in one day, well, the walls in Malawi, so we can bridge the gap of infrastructure that is needed in certain countries. We have concrete materials that are allowing to have urban forest and checking on the urban heat island effect, etc., etc. So all of this exists. Some cities already do it, and we have an example here where the green procurement is at the heart of their demand. And if we could have EPD deployed everything, I think that would not be that complicated, really.
Thank you, Magali. What do you think, Stephen? Is this a problem solved?
Well, one thing is there are a couple of differentiations. Let's assume that is all true for Switzerland. Of course, we have a global problem. We need to address it globally. There's addressing it only in some countries is insufficient. That means, as we said before, we need to create inclusiveness, not only across social strata, but also across countries, across borders. I don't think we are there yet. The technologies which are existing need to be shared. Participation of more players need to be there. You mentioned before, you're sitting here also in a way representing an association of manufacturers, which is, you said 80% of the production outside China. That would probably mean in the order of 2 percentage points of climate impact anthropogenic, I would think, somewhere there, 1, 2. So significant, and it fits into one association, which gives an answer why the suggestion to go with life cycle assessment, given the urgency of matters, is I fully understand your wish. I'm coming from an industry originally, the chemical side, which was exactly in the same position, exactly with the same argument, and it didn't fly. It didn't fly because regulators felt not enough time, too much detail. We have a few people here who can change the world. We will task them to do it. I think we both know, this is what is happening. The trick is to carry everyone around. So what I think we need to see is more international cooperation, more exchange, so that manufacturers around the whole globe are actually moving. There's still enough differentiation for markets, that's no doubt, but there has to be the general trend to move forward, I wouldn't say together, but somehow jointly across the same pathway and to enable many countries to do so at the same time.
Thank you, Stephen. And maybe last from James.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of that short term, again, I go and read those roadmaps. The UK Green Building Council released one today. There'll be another 9 coming, and they say, let's start mandating whole life carbon assessment. Fantastic to see colleagues from Arup say they're going to do this in all of their projects going forward at this COP. Starting to do that sets us up in terms of getting that transparency and will enable some more of that, the target setting with teeth that we need ultimately in legislation.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the end of our panel discussion. I think we have seen that creating demand signal for construction is key. It's encouraging to see all these initiatives already happening. So governments and cities are pledging to buy green construction projects. We have very eager building suppliers, materials developers who are ready, willing, and able to engage. But we also recognize that more needs to be done. We've talked about having to make sure that more governments, more cities, more companies join this green pledge. We also recognize that there needs to be, we have existing standards, we need to deploy them, we need to ensure that they are aligned, and we also need to ensure that there's an equitable shift as we go into green public construction. That's all we have for today. Thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you, our panelists.